Our words for reflection were written by the Reverend Joe Cherry. Joy is hard. Joy requires us to feel safe enough, to be safe enough, to open to vulnerability. To feel joy, you must be brave. Joy walks into a room after the space has been cleared of shame, cleared of doubt, cleared of self-recrimination. Joy is hard. Joy is hard, and joy is worth the hard work of preparation, preparing oneself and setting down all the defenses, all the shoulds and could-haves, all the should not haves and might haves. Joy is worth the work. You are worth the work. You can start small. The simple pleasures of your favorite tea, the grand freedom of a full belly laugh. Invite joy to be your companion.
I was listening to a podcast this week that asked the question, does having children make you happier? The research-based answer to this, in case you were wondering, is no. Statistically, people with kids are less happy than those without. Maybe not what you were expecting. But as I write this, on the morning after a night where no one in my house wanted to sleep, this answer feels very relatable. But I wonder if all these researchers were actually asking the wrong question. Because if I were asked if being a parent has made me happier, I might hesitate with my response. But if asked if it had brought me joy, the answer would be much clearer. Yes, absolutely, being a parent has brought me joy. The concept of joy is a tricky one, much trickier perhaps than simple surface happiness. When I think about it, I actually come up with more questions than answers. Is joy related to happiness or pleasure or delight? Does joy kind of sneak up on us, or do we create it? Are we waiting for it, or are we cultivating it? Does it look like the exuberant freedom from that first anthem we heard, the song from The Wiz, where the fear and pain are gone all of a sudden? Or is it more like the gentle simplicity of the song we just heard Steve sing so beautifully, the ongoing enjoyment of the passing of time? What is this joy thing really all about? The stories of this December holiday season point to some answers to this in various ways. The Christmas story evokes that exuberant joy, that all of a sudden hope and joy is born into the world in the form of a baby. The Advent season that leads up to Christmas, that we're in the midst of right now, leads us more towards waiting and watching, preparing ourselves for some big joy that is yet to come. Hanukkah is more about a joy that sneaks up on us, the gradual miracle of 8 days of light when they only expected one. And the winter solstice calls us to create joy, to light fires and to make merry together through the longest night. So maybe our very you answer to this question of joy is that joy is not a monolith. Joy can come in all of these ways and more. Sometimes exuberant and sometimes simple, sometimes all at once and sometimes more gradual. Sometimes we patiently wait for joy, and other times we make it happen. This would be the judicious, playing it safe answer to the question, the one that would be sure not to offend anyone. And yet, it's an answer that doesn't ask much of us. Our theme this month is not just joy, but rather the act of opening to joy. That theme demands our participation, calls us not to ask not just what is joy, but instead, how does our faith call us to open ourselves to joy? The answer to this is a little trickier. As Joe Cherry wrote in our Words for Reflection, joy is hard. We have to work for it, not just wait for it. Researcher, storyteller Brené Brown agrees with this assessment of joy. In fact, she claims that joy is the most difficult, terrifying emotion that we experience as humans. That's probably not what you expected to hear in a sermon about joy. Joy is difficult. Joy is terrifying. That's nothing like the exuberance of that song from The Wiz. Nothing like joy to the world, the Lord is come. Brené Brown is pointing to a very different truth about joy, and that is that joy is, by its nature, precarious. She writes, "In a culture of deep scarcity, of never feeling safe, certain, and sure enough, joy can feel like a setup. We're always waiting for the other shoe to drop. Scarcity and fear drive foreboding joy. We're afraid that the feeling of joy won't last, or that we won't be enough, or that the transition to disappointment or whatever is in store for us next will be too difficult." The hardest thing about this opening to joy is that we know that at any moment, that joy could be taken away from us. We worry that truly opening ourselves to joy also leaves us vulnerable to loss, disappointment, and pain. So sometimes we try to protect ourselves by not fully feeling that joy. But by doing what Brown calls dress rehearsing tragedy. But what Brown found in her research is that this effort to protect ourselves doesn't actually do any good. And it robs us of the deep joy we may have been able to experience otherwise. Brown interviewed a man once who told her that his whole life he never got too excited, too joyful about anything. He just kind of stayed right in the middle. That way, if things didn't work out, he wouldn't be devastated, and if they did work out, it was a pleasant surprise. And then in his 60s, he was in a car accident. His wife of 40 years was killed. And he told Brown, "The second I realized she was gone, the first thing I thought was, I should have leaned harder into those moments of joy, because that did not protect me from what I feel right now." Despite trying to keep the pain at bay, he still felt it just as deeply as he would have otherwise. And he missed out on all those years of feeling that joy just as deeply. Joy is precarious, but perhaps that is also what makes it powerful and precious, and, as Joe Cherry writes, worth the work. These pandemic times have made us feel all the more deeply that precarity of joy. How many times have our plans, big or small, been taken away, hopes dashed by yet another wave? I know I was feeling this as I wrote that note to you all this week about resuming some indoor, in-person worship and programs. I'll admit I wrote a somewhat dreary first draft of that letter, which I luckily sent to the Ask the Safe Congregation team to take a look at before I actually sent it out. Our very wise president, Brenna Woods, suggested that maybe I make it a little more positive. This is a happy move, they reminded me, and we should at least pretend we are looking forward to it, even if I had to fake it at first. I realized pretty quickly that they were absolutely right. I was so caught up in my worry in dress rehearsing tragedy that I had forgotten how much joy might come from this decision. I was scared to feel that joy because everything feels scary right now. Everything feels precarious, like it may be taken away at any moment. And I know I've been disappointed quite enough in the last 2 years. But not feeling that joy was not going to protect me or you or anyone from the potential disappointment or loss. I wanted this joy of coming back together in person to be perfect, to be uncomplicated, to be complete and exuberant, like that song from The Wiz, Everybody Rejoice. But the truth is that it's just not. This coming together again is complicated. It is incomplete and slow. It is scary. It is precarious. But as Brenna reminded me, it is also joyful. And so I went and I listened to that exuberant Wiz song 3 times, set my worries aside for a moment, and tried to open myself to joy as I rewrote the letter. This new stage of the pandemic has us recalibrating a lot of things. The ways we are keeping each other safe, the risks we are willing to take, what it means to not wait for this to magically be over, but instead to live with COVID-19 for the long haul. And I think it may also mean recalibrating our capacity for joy, opening ourselves to joy even though it makes us vulnerable. Reverend Aaliyah Kemmler tells us that the old stories we retell at this time of the year have clues to what it means to be joyful in this time. She writes, "They tell us something important about the nature of joy, that joy can break through like starlight or candlelight in the darkness, but that it is surrounded by the hard stuff of everyday life. Maybe that makes it all the more precious," she says. "The stories remind us that there is still and always joy in this world, and it is for everyone. But it usually comes right alongside the struggle." Mary and Joseph make a long, tired journey to Bethlehem before the joy of the baby's birth. The Maccabees live in the hills, fighting desperate battles and impossible odds before winning back their city and the oil in the temple lamp burning for 8 days. Winter solstice arrives in the midst of the deepest darkness. The joy comes alongside the waiting. It comes alongside the pain and the fear and the uncertainty and has nothing to do with ideal circumstances. So in this season of joy alongside pandemic and fear, joy without the ideal circumstances, I invite you to join me in opening your heart anyway, opening up to that vulnerability of joy. Don't suppress the joy in order to avoid the pain. We know that never works. Instead, open yourself to it all: the joy, the love, the gratitude, and the hope. Joy is hard, but it is most certainly worth it.